The axe bit the air and bone. The master executioner kept his shoulders locked and drove the haft with one practiced, measured swing. The condemned noble's wrist snapped under the rope, and a thin red arc appeared where flesh gave to steel. Fear sits in the room like a person. Fear is what keeps the marshal's eyes on the master, and the crowd's murmurs from growing into a single, ordered sound. The opening action is not a thing of theater but a test. Perform without error, or lose everything. The master, 45, stocky, a long scar carving his face from temple to cheek, counts each motion with his breath. He hears the marshal's boots on flagstone and knows that the cut will be judged beyond anatomy by politics, by reputation, by the appetite for spectacle. At dusk the hall smelled of tallow and wet leather. The crowd pressed along the benches, merchants with soot on their sleeves, a powdered lady covering a trimmer with gloved fingers, soldiers whose hands never stopped flexing. The crown sent the royal marshal's observer, not as helper. The marshal's presence converted a routine sentence into an audition. The master had performed dozens of executions, but this one carried a different weight. After the first swing, the court physician stood at the railing with his narrow face lit by candlelight, studying the separation as if it were a specimen under a lens. After the cut, the marshal did not applaud master, he said, voice flat, and the master felt the word hit like the haft hitting wood, a hairline misalignment. The tendon clings. You were sloppy at the hinge. The marshal's accusation is blunt and unadorned. It carries a consequence that is not spoken. The master answers by taking off his gauntlet and dipping a finger into the warm, congealing blood on the tool table. He does not defend himself in phrases. He tightens the strap on his leather apron and walks toward the antechamber where the court physician waits. Inside the antechamber, the court physician pulls the removed limb onto a table and slides a lamp closer. He points to a thin ridge of torn fascia and says, "See there. The cut grazed the tendon sheath. The crowd will see ragged edges as cruelty." Not craft. The master watches the physician's finger press where bone and tendon meet and hears the clack of a file against a metal tray. He feels shame move through him, not as abstract sorrow, but as a physical tightening under the jaw and the slow, careful swallow of a man who measures everything. Shame quickly becomes strategy. The master retracts into work. He orders the apprentice to fetch the broad axe with the worn haft and the small chisels from the tool belt. Apprentice, he says, voice low, pass the file. Then the wedge. The apprentice obeys with hands that shake and fingers that smell faintly of pitch. The master sets the tools in a precise line. He counts them aloud, breathing on each number. The counting is ritual and control. The court physician looks on and, after a moment, speaks less like a judge and more like a collaborator. Precision will sell this to them. The physician says, make them see bone and engineered order. Let the cut speak for the crown. An hour later, a sealed order arrives. A messenger drops the scroll on the workbench and does not meet the master's eyes. The wax seal is crushed with the crown's emblem. The command carries no ambiguous language. A high-born prisoner is to be dismembered in full daylight, anatomically obvious, performed so that joint, tendon, and bone are visible to the crowd. The messenger's wrists are raw where his gloves rubbed. He says only, the marshal will attend. You will be judged. The arrival of the order is an external event that shifts the room. The master reads and feels his priorities compress into a single, inescapable line, perform perfectly. In the private study late that night, the master and the court physician lay out a sheepskin of anatomical sketches by candlelight. The physician's fingers trace the contour of the radius, the feel of the ulna, the point where tendons anchor into bone. Make the line here. The physician instructs. Tapping a tendon on the page expose the joint so that the humerus pinches open and the radius separates in one clean motion. The crowd must identify the anatomy without being told. The master nods and mimics the tapping motion with his own scarred hand. He tilts his head as if judging alignment. His breath is slow and controlled. He does not say he hates the work. He says only, "If it must be done, it will be done without doubt." His voice holds a different note, resolve hardened by fear and a thread of pride. The emotion shifts again, shame to resolve manifested in how he sets the leather gauntlets back on and pulls the hooded cloak up to his shoulders. They rehearse on a corpse in the annex before dawn. The corpse is a farmer's body donated by a sheriff. The skin has the cold, waxy pull of something that no longer breathes. The master works with chisels and wedges. He marks the joint with a charcoal line and positions the cleaving iron. At the first strike, the blade binds in cartilage and slides, and the master feels the pull of failure in his arms. The apprentice moves to steady the limb, and the physician taps a ring against the table in irritation again. The physician says again. Now the apprentice's reply is a single short sentence. "Yes, master." The master repeats the motion. He wedges the iron, adjusts the angle, and finds a different fulcrum. The blade takes more now, but the cut is not clean. The master stops and presses his thumb into his forehead. The rehearsal failure is immediate and concrete, a blade binding and a public risk. The master tastes copper on his tongue, a sign of the adrenaline spike he never mentions. The failure becomes leverage. The royal marshal calls the master to a stone corridor at dawn. The marshal blocks the passage with his broad frame and says, "You will not fail me, executioner." "Fail me and I replace you by noon," the master answers. "Replace me and find someone who can make the bones speak." The marshal's next words are softer and more precise. "This is not about your craft. It is about the message. Succeed and you keep your station. Fail and you vanish from court rolls. You understand the stakes." Their exchange includes rapid, clipped lines. The marshal says, "You must make them see." The master replies, "I will." The marshal, unblinking, says, "Make them remember." A second rehearsal follows, this time with modifications. The master sharpens the axe edge and files a minute bevel into the haft to change the arc. The apprentice tests the grip, panting in the cold. The court physician supervises, peering at the patient's joints and instructing where to part ligaments so tendons hang back like pulled ropes. The master times his swing with the candle's wobble. He breathes in, holds, and swings. The blade catches precisely where intended. The separation reveals the humerus and the radial head. The physician nods. For a moment the master feels vindicated. The emotion swells toward a brittle calm. He glances at the apprentice and says nothing. The silence is a contained conversation. On the morning of the public spectacle, the yard fills with banners and a row of city trumpeters who do not play. The condemned noble is brought in, his mouth gagged but his eyes cleanly astonished. The marshal takes his place on a dais, and the court physician sets a small metal tray near the execution block. The master watches the marshal's jaw. It is a measuring instrument. He tastes fear again, not private now, but communal, pressed between rows of faces. He adjusts his gauntlet and walks to the block. The crowd hushes. When he steps up, the master executes the same ritual motions he has practiced: count, align, breathe, strike. The first wedge opens tendon with the sound of taut rope snapping. The crowd leans without sound. The master chants nothing. His hands move. The court physician peers at the visible bone and signals with one finger. The marshal's head tilts once, a tiny sign of appraisal. Then, at the final stroke, the blade binds against an unexpected knot of cartilage. The master feels the haft jar. He releases his breath in a single short gasp and jerks to free the axe. A murmur runs through the benches, a ripple of revaluation. Rapid exchange of lines follows between the marshal and a guard. Was that precise? The marshal asks. It held, sir, the guard says. The marshal's reply is a single word. Noted. The master finishes with a supplementary cut, using a hand file and a small chisel to reveal the joint. The action is surgical and mechanical. There is no grace in it, only necessity. Inside the crowd, a merchant whispers, "Did you see the tendon? Clean as carved meat," a soldier says. "The crown will be satisfied." The master hears them like an aftersound. He walks off the platform feeling both vindicated and hollow. The victory tastes metallic. The court physician records the result in ink, noting the exposed structures and writing a brief phrase, "Anatomical clarity achieved." Minor deviation corrected the marshal's approval. When it comes is an economized nod. The master lowers his head but keeps his posture exact. The apprentice meets his eye and for the first time in the chapter speaks a line that matters. "Master, you held when it bound." The master responds, 2 words. Even and unreadable. You watched, the apprentice answers. I saw their exchange cements an inward shift, from fear to a guarded steadiness, and under it, a dawning recognition that technique has become a weapon turned outward by men who rule. That night, when the crowd disperses and the wax burns low, the master sits in the workshop and sets down a blood-stained wedge beside his tools. He cleans with oil and a cloth, the rhythmic motion deliberate as he counts the edges with his fingertips. The court physician returns with a small folio and says, "The crown wants more spectacles like this. We will design them for message, not just punishment." Message to whom? The master asks. To those who think the crown weak. The physician replies. The physician's tone is clinical. His fingers tap a margin where he has made a note. The master presses his thumb into the seam of the folio and feels the coarse paper under his nail. The emotional shift here is quiet. Resolve moves toward dread as the master realizes his craft will be employed again and again for displays that are political tools. An apprentice's knock comes at midnight. The apprentice slips in, eyes wide, and reports a rumor. Courtiers speak of a rival noble who plans to petition the marshal to have the master removed as scapegoat for an earlier execution deemed too lenient. The master listens and does not rise. He holds his cup of water and lifts it to his mouth without drinking. "Hands steady then, I will not give them a reason," he says. The apprentice asks, "Master, are you afraid?" The master does not answer with the word. Instead, he checks the edge of his broad axe and runs a rag down the haft. The gesture says what words might unduly expose. By dawn, an unexpected note arrives. One of the crowd's witnesses, a surgeon who had watched from the rail, sends a message to the court physician, praising the master's control and requesting an audience to study technique. The physician reads it aloud, voice thin with mild surprise. He writes, "He could teach others," the physician says. The master hears in that line the possibility of security and also the risk of becoming an instrument beyond his own control. He looks at the axe, then at the scar running down his cheek, then at the tools lined like soldiers on the bench. The chapter's final external event is the knocking at the workshop door, a young guard delivering a sealed invitation from a neighboring court to come demonstrate technique. The master opens the envelope with fingers that do not tremble and reads the line, "Come show the craft." Your station is at risk and at stake. He folds the paper along its crease and places it on the bench. He decides to go. The decision is concrete: pack the axe, wrap the gauntlets, secure the small tools, and take the apprentice. He ties the cloth over the handle of the broad axe and hooks the file to his belt. The last image of the chapter is not introspective. It is the master slipping his hand under the strap of his leather apron and fastening it, looking at the doorway, and stepping out with measured pace. A single guard at the threshold nods and says, "Master," he replies. We leave at first light. The door shuts behind them with the groan of iron hinges, and the smell of tallow follows them into the corridor. The chapter closes on the concrete beat of departure and the knowledge that the craft will be tested again before the crown's appetite is sated. Emotion root: fear. The first sentences show fear as a driving force, and it motivates the master's choices throughout: to rehearse, to adapt his tools, and to accept dangerous commissions. 2 major emotion shifts occur: shame, resolve, dread, and fear, guarded steadiness, acceptance. These shifts appear through physical signs, through dialogue, and through actions. The chapter follows the beats of public spectacle: inspection, sealed order, anatomical study, rehearsal, failure, threat by the marshal, climactic public execution, and aftermath. Resolving the chapter's immediate conflict, The master survives his public test but understands his craft will be reused as a political instrument. The ending is a concrete decision: leave to demonstrate and defend his station rather than an abstract promise. The axe hung half raised and the master executioner did not move. Suspicion traced the marshal's jaw as he stepped forward and said, "Show us the line of bone." Prove the method. The crowd shifted. The condemned man on the table made a small, raw sound and the apprentice gripped the table edge. Within seconds, the demonstration had become a public test of competence and a political question about who served the crown best. From the first strike in this room 6 months earlier, the master had built a reputation on exact measures and ritual count. He had once driven the haft with one measured swing, and the noble's wrist had snapped under the rope. The chamber still remembered that night when the axe bit air and bone. Tonight, suspicion now threaded the space between technique and theater. That suspicion would force choices: adapt the ritual or risk replacement. The narrator notes the central problem plainly. The marshal's demand turned a trade into evidence. The master's livelihood depended on perceived precision. The marshal's line of questioning made the stakes immediate. The crown could replace methods with medically favored operators. The master felt the first shift in his posture. He squared his shoulders and inhaled, counting silently. The room was the royal execution chamber late in the evening. Candles burned in iron sconces and their light pooled on flagstones. A dais held the demonstration table. The court surgeon stood near the table with waxed papers and an observing tray of instruments. The royal marshal wore a short cloak with a signet and a list of names in his hand. The apprentice stayed just behind the master's elbow, fingers stained by oil and old blood. The master, stocky and muscled, held the axe with a surgeon's familiarity. He had a scar from temple to cheek and a neck chain with a serrated pendant that glinted when he turned. The marshal spoke with a clipped tone. "Master executioner, we have orders. Every public separation must follow anatomical protocol. The crown will not suffer improvisation." The marshal laid a finger on the table. He named the problem in public words: procedure, accountability, and the risk of a spectacle that might disgrace the court. The court surgeon added, "We will note alignment, incision, and joint preservation. If your method fails, we will assign the next commission to Dravit's man." The surgeon's voice was steady, but his eyes moved across the cadaver's bindings as if searching for a precise point to challenge. The first emotional shift took place in the master. Suspicion hardened into defiance. He nothing at first. He set the haft down, checked edge alignment against his thumb, and touched the scar that ran along his cheek as if calming a muscle. In his hands, ritual and craft were identical. He had trained year after year to read the way ligaments parted and bone gave way. To the master, brutality was craft. To the marshal, it was a state instrument. The difference between those readings would widen. By the time the marshal ordered an inspection, the court surgeon had already begun his checklist: measure the femoral angle. He instructed the apprentice, not the master. The apprentice moved with trembling deliberation. The surgeon lifted the cadaver's limb and ran his fingers along an old healed fracture, then frowned. He found a looped scar beneath the skin where ancient ligature had been placed. "This complicates standard separation," the surgeon announced aloud. At that line, a new shift of emotion arrived. The master's face tightened, and the room's incredulity moved toward him. The marshal did not pause. "You will schedule the next spectacle." He said, "Your standing depends on compliance with our protocols. Consider this your formal mandate." He tapped his list. The decision converted the master's craft into a political obligation. The marshal's threat was concrete. It repositioned the master from artist to functionary and forced a tactical response. The master bowed his chin, then turned to the curtained alcove where apprentices and tools waited. Behind the curtain, the master worked with the apprentice. The night smelled of tar and oil. The master spoke in short sentences while he measured, showed the apprentice how to place the leather gauntlets, and corrected his hand placement. Count 3 here. Slide the thumb. Do not show uncertainty before them, he said. The apprentice answered with a clipped, halting voice, Master. Count 3, thumb. Do not show. The master stopped him with a look. He ran his hand along the haft, demonstrating the balance. He tapped the file on the table to set rhythm. His instruction mixed practical technique with the ritual cadence he guarded. The private calibration was a test of transmission. The apprentice learned by touch and repetition. The master insisted on silent precision, a ritual of breath, foot placement, and an exact tolly spoken only under the breath. The master wanted the apprentice to mimic not only the motion, but the absence of hesitation. This focus on steadiness represented another emotional shift, defiance of public doubt, replaced by a fierce, internal strain to maintain reputation. They worked through the cadaver's tissues. The master showed the apprentice how to identify thickened ligaments, how to avoid old callus that would bind instruments, and how to set a guide mark in the flesh. He counted under his breath and tapped the haft twice to mark alignment. The apprentice mirrored the motions and whispered back the count. Outside the curtain, footsteps approached. The marshal returned. The court surgeon followed, carrying a small lamp and a rolled parchment. The surgeon did not bother with ceremony. He leaned over the cadaver and pressed his thumb into a healed fracture. He traced the ligature scar again and said, "This limb has been altered before. Bonding and scar tissue will resist a single stroke separation. You cannot guarantee one clean severance across this lesion." His tone was clinical, but his placement of the observation was a strategic wound. The master's jaw clenched. He removed his gauntlet and flexed his calloused hands. For the first time in public, he let a small exhalation show an outward sign of the inward pressure that had shifted from defiance to constrained fear. The marshal's voice rose by a notch. "Then we have standards. The surgeon will set the protocol. You either follow it or stand aside." Rapid dialogue followed. "Marshal, the master, this is my work. I will adapt. How?" "The marshal be following steps you have no trade in," the surgeon replied. The master answered in short, bare words, no bone. "I learned this line." The marshal, "We will watch. The next spectacle is the test." There were 3 quick exchanges, then a pause. The room felt like it held its breath. The threat of replacement floated in the room as concrete as a signed parchment. The marshal left a notation with his seal and named the next public event. He assigned the master to perform under the surgeon's scrutiny. The master felt the marrow of his craft exposed. He returned to the curtained alcove and spent the next hours calibrating edge and angle with the apprentice. They rehearsed placement and counted aloud to steady their hands. The master corrected the apprentice's thumb placement again and again, slowing and retracing each motion with a mechanic's insistence. The apprentice began to sweat and his voice trembled. "Master, what if I fail?" he asked. The master did not offer comfort. He tightened the apprentice's grip on the haft and said, "Do not think of failure, think of the count. 3. 1, 2, 3. That exchange compressed the emotional register from fear into a hard, collected action. Dawn leaned toward night. The chamber refilled with the murmur of courtiers and the hush of officials. The marshal took his place on the dais. The surgeon stood at the table with parchment and a small knife for demonstration. The condemned man was brought forward, hands bound and face pale under candlelight. The master walked to the center and set the axe on the table as he had 100 times. The apprentice took his station. The court surgeon inspected the limb and measured joint alignment. The crowd quieted. The demonstration began with precise ritual. The master spoke his brief commands. He placed a hand flat on the cadaver's flesh and felt for the joint plane. He tapped twice to set the count. He placed the axe and lifted, the haft an extension of his arm. The surgeon watched every micro-adjustment. The marshal's eyes tracked the movement like a metronome. The apprentice mirrored the motions and handed the master a linen strap at the exact moment the master needed it. Outside the dais, a scribe bent to copy notes. Halfway through the action, the surgeon leaned in. "Hold, master. There is an anomaly under the fascia," he said. The master felt the haft bind. The instrument snagged on a dense cord beneath the skin. The sound of metal against tissue changed. The master expected a clean give. It did not come. He tried to adjust angle by a fraction. The haft bucked and stuck. The apprentice pressed his hand to the table and hissed. "The marshal, finish it," the surgeon whispered. "Careful. Do not split the joint." The master paused, felt his pulse, and then moved into improvisation. This was the mid-chapter cliffhanger. For a long 2 beats the room hung on the decision: maintain ritual or use raw force. The master chose raw force. He abandoned his counted swing and forced the haft downward with a grunt. The blade caught more flesh than bone. Tension spiked in the chamber. The surgeon moved to help, but the master pushed him away with a forearm that smelled of tar. Voices rose. "Master, step aside," the marshal ordered. The master answered, "No." The exchange lasted 5 short lines as the atmosphere moved from technical scrutiny to loud, practical alarm. When the plan failed to yield a clean separation, the master resorted to a brutal finish. He used a shorter stroke and a hammer to drive the haft through a resistant section. The sound of staff on haft echoed. Flesh tore in a way measured craft had tried to avoid. The condemned man gasped and made a spasm that the apprentice could not hold. Someone in the crowd cried out. The surgeon began to record details, his pen moving in clipped strokes as if cataloguing an experiment's failure. The marshal ordered the chamber cleared for medical examination. The master finished the act with a raw, necessary force that undid the careful spectacle he had built his career upon. In the stunned silence after the final descent, there were immediate consequences. The marshal penned a note. The surgeon rose and walked to the record desk, his hands stained with both oil and flame from the lamp. He read aloud a phrase and then added surgical notations: existing fracture, unusual ligature, instrument binding, forced finish. The crowd watched the marshal's hand stamp the parchment. The apprentice put his head in his hands and then turned to vomit into the basin when he could not hold the steady breath. The master wiped his blade on his sleeve and set the haft down more gently than the scene warranted. He moved as if his shoulders had closed in on an unseen wound. That night the marshal convened a short inquiry. He questioned the master by name. "Master executioner," he said, "explain your method." The master replied in steady, halting sentences, admitting adaptation and improvisation. The surgeon intervened with clinical corrections. "You must illustrate how you would prevent future binding," he said. A transcript of the exchange was made. The marshal's actions were decisive. The master would perform one more supervised operation before a final judgment. The decision extended the conflict but also supplied a path to resolution. The surgeon filed his notes and labeled samples to be sent to the crown's physician. He repeated technical terms aloud so that those present would not misread them as rumor: scar tissue, osteophyte formation, ligamentous adhesion. Each technical term lowered the public's sympathy for the master's ritual. It reframed the event into a medical problem rather than a failure of will. That reframing changed how courtiers discussed the night. Some began to say the master had been unlucky. Others began to whisper that the surgeon, with his ledger of favored men, had an interest in displacing a long-standing operator. The apprentice's reaction marked another emotional shift. He moved from trembling to a sudden, rigid calm. He followed the master into the alcove and asked in a small voice, "Master, will they take the job?" The master looked at him, counting in silence as he had Torty prove the line. He said, "You prove the line, and we show we can adapt." The apprentice's breath hitched and then became regular. Action replaced panic. The master handed the apprentice the file and said, "Sharpen every edge, pack clean linens. Practice the count." The apprentice nodded, and the ritual returned, though tempered now by fear. The surgeon, meanwhile, pressed a political advantage. He recommended a formal demonstration be recorded and presented to the Crown's Council. He named 2 assistants Who could demonstrate protocol if needed? Bring them both, the marshal ordered. The master heard the phrase Dravit's man again and understood that his rival waited in the wings. That realization was a quiet blow. It forced the master to take deliberate measures, reinforce technique, consult old notes, and remove any doubt in his public comportment. In the days that followed, rehearsals consumed the alcove. The master worked the apprentice through alignment drills and forced the apprentice to call out the count under increasing distraction. A bowl tipping, a guard clearing his throat, a courtier hissing. They practiced until colluses stung and the apprentice's voice grew hoarse. The surgeon inspected their mock separations and marked corrections. Each correction narrowed the field of acceptable motion. The master kept his face immobile, but his hands would shake at times when he thought no one watched. That was a private sign of the pressure that suspicion had wrought. When the next public test arrived, courtiers filled the chamber again. The crown's physician sat with other officials. The marshal read aloud the new conditions. The surgeon performed a final visual check and declared the cadaver's anomalies in detail. The master approached the table with a measured gait. He set the axe, placed his hands, and counted in a voice barely above a whisper. He looked at the marshal and then at the surgeon. He felt the day's rehearsals in the steadiness of his fingers. The apprentice stood ready. The axe struck. For the first time since the surgeon's discovery, the instrument moved with the measured give that had once defined the master. The separation was not perfect. Scar tissue had altered the expected planes. Yet the strike followed the line the master had marked under the surgeon's eye. The surgeon nodded, pausing before his pen moved. The marshal's expression shifted, not to approval but to a guarded acknowledgement. The crowd released a breath that had been held for a long while. After the demonstration, the marshal recorded the results as both scandal and necessary spectacle. He filed his notes in the ledger. The surgeon cross-referenced his entries and placed a small seal on the report. The apprentice refused to meet the master's gaze for a while, then approached and placed a hand on the master's foremaster. He said, "You counted true." The master answered with a single word-work. It was not triumph, and it was not apology. It was a directive to keep the craft intact. Finally, the chapter closed on concrete beats. The marshal sealed his notes and left the dais. The surgeon folded his parchments and ordered samples taken to the palace for further study. The master walked back into the curtained alcove with a splintered haft in his hands, and the apprentice following. Outside, a clerk carried the marshal's ledger toward the council. In the alcove, the master set the haft aside, checked the edge, and told the apprentice to prepare the linen wraps. The apprentice obeyed with a hands-on motion that showed both fatigue and renewed resolution. This chapter ends not with broad reflection, but with a situational move, the marshal's seal, the surgeon's samples, and the master preparing for a final judgment. The conflict over craft and authority remains unresolved at the highest level, but within the chamber the master has secured a fragile proof of adaptation. The room will remember the night as one in which ritual met anatomy, and both answered with a splintered truth. The royal marshal struck his iron rod on the oak floor and barked, "Demonstrate the line now." Courtiers leaned forward. A bound body slid on the slab and the apprentice braced both hands at the wrist. Fear tightened the apprentice's throat. Fear guided his fingers on the blade and made him obey. The antechamber off the royal gallery had filled in minutes. Torchlight licked the edges of heavy tapestries. The marshal's command made private craft public. The problem was simple and brutal: prove technical mastery before the gallery, or be cast from court and lose livelihood and protection. The master executioner stepped up without haste. He kept his shoulders locked and his thumb across the haft. He had performed at the marshal's side since the marshal was a young officer. The crowd knew the ritual of the axe from earlier spectacles. That reputation now stood on a measured edge. A herald shoved through and mouthed the charge to the marshal. The marshal repeated it aloud. Prove it here. Show the line of separation. If you cannot, you will stand down. The marshal's voice carried authority that issued orders into the bones of men. The stakes made a thin, metallic stillness hang over the room. The apprentice glanced at the master. The master inclined his head and showed no tremor. The apprentice watched the master judge alignment with a tilt of the head. Suspicion passed through the marshal's face when the court physician appeared at the platform edge, clutching a leather-bound ledger. The appearance of the ledger altered the calculus in a single moment. The physician's fingers were ink-stained and the ledger's corners had been worn soft. He held it up where the torchlight caught the edges of its pages. These notes contradict the public method, he said. The gallery shifted its weight like a single animal. The court had gathered for spectacle, not subtlety. The master measured the tendons and bone with practiced eyes. He drew a chalk line along the limb and spoke. Stand back. Watch the mark. The crowd leaned forward. Spectators sniffed and muttered. The apprentice steadied the condemned noble with both palms at the shoulder. His palms were damp. The marshal moved closer, rod tapping twice. He will see the line. He said he will see whether practice or law holds. He glanced at the court physician and then at the master. If technique or legality is proved, the crown will decide who remains authorized. If not, who will maintain order? His question forced the chamber to name its requirement, a public demonstration that resolved both craft and law. The master answered with a measurement and a slow inventory of tools. He set a broad axe on the bench and ran a file along its edge. He lifted a narrow saw and tapped its teeth. He did not raise his voice. He breathed with slow, controlled sighs and counted his steps under his breath. The apprentice repeated the steps with fingers that did not match the master's steadiness. A murmur rose when the physician flipped the ledger's pages. The sketches inside were exact. They showed lines of incision, labeled muscles, and notes in a compact hand, places where live dissections had been performed. Where tendon slack could be used to separate without bursting the femoral artery at once. The physician read one aloud. Entry at the lateral margin and follow the plane to the joint capsule. Do not sever the artery until joint release. His voice made names of tendons and vessels sound like accusations. The crowd reacted with two motions at once, fascination and revulsion. A spectator hissed. A woman in the gallery clicked her tongue. The marshal's jaw tightened. He stepped between the master and the physician. You accuse him of illegal practice. The marshally present evidence, the physician replied. He did not lower the ledger. These pages are from the master's own experiments or from his associates. They record live dissections done without sanction. The physician's tone was clinical, then edged to contempt. The marshal's face shifted between doubt and obligation. A rapid exchange followed. The master spoke 3 short sentences. Those notes are technique I taught in the field. I learned from soldiers and surgeons. Technique serves the crown, the physician answered. Technique that cuts into living sinew without consent is unlawful. Technique that records experiments on the living is evidence. The marshal barked. Enough. We will settle this with a demonstration and a hearing. The gallery hummed with the charged edges of judgment. The apprentice felt his hands trembling under the weight of the slab. He heard the master count a silent measure and then say, You place the blade where I mark. You make the first cut. The marshal's order made the instruction law. The apprentice's throat constricted. Fear sharpened into a decision: obey and survive, or refuse and be left exposed. He placed the blade where the master indicated. The first incision met unexpected resistance. Flesh resisted like a living rope. The apprentice's wrist twitched. He glanced at the marshal, then at the master. The master did not move to seize the blade. He watched, tilt of head precise, measuring the apprentice's pace deeper, but not across the plane. The master. Voices rose. Hold him. Someone shouted. The marshal's men reached for the noble's restraints. The apprentice's cut drew a thin arc of red where the knife slipped along a tendon sheath. The condemned noble made a small hoarse sound. The crowd inhaled as one body. The court physician pushed through and held up the ledger to the light again, calling out a specific entry that suggested a different line and a different method. The ledger exposed a new problem. Pages described experiments that emphasized anatomical knowledge beyond mere spectacle. The court physician announced a passage that accused the master of using live subjects to test points where nerves and arteries met. The gallery broke into whispers that hardened into accusation. The marshal's authority wavered for the first time. He could order arrest, but the crowd demanded demonstration and evidence. Inside the gallery, a debate became a clash. The marshal, you ask proof, physician. The proof will be the demonstration. We will see whether your words match action, the physician answered. My obligation is to the law and the body. The ledger is proof unless the master proves the necessity, the master simply. Only a live demonstration will silence doubt. His voice stripped away the pretense and offered a test that required the condemned noble's body. The room held its breath as the marshal weighed law and spectacle. He turned to the crowd. Because the matter touches the crown's instruments, we will allow a live demonstration under guard. If the ledger's charges are true, the master will face sanction. If the method holds, the crown will decide his fate. He struck the rod again. The decision pushed the chamber toward a single violent resolution. That choice made the demonstration inevitable. The master moved with a measured cadence. He strapped the noble securely and arranged his tools like a craftsman setting instruments. The crowd moved closer despite the marshal's attempt to enforce distance. Spectators pressed elbows and leaned on balustrades. The apprentice set the blade at the mark and waited for the master's cue. Before the final cut, the physician stepped forward and slammed the ledger onto the bench. He read a passage that named a place of incision. The master had not shown your ledger records a second technique. The physician that severs a certain bundle of tendons, first to prevent immediate hemorrhage, but relies on live contraction to reveal correct planes. That is experiment, not authorized practice. His words landed like stones. The master answered with short authority. Technique adapts. The crown demands efficiency. We serve that demand. The marshal's face hardened. He looked at the condemned noble. He looked at the apprentice. Proceed, he said. The marshal's order transformed argument into action. The apprentice began. The blade slid and found the plane. The master guided his hand by the apprentice's movement, calling out small, clipped corrections. The apprentice's voice was thin as he said, left. Hold the tendon. The master, steady each word, redirected muscle and intent. Halfway through, resistance increased. The noble gasped. The saw scraped for ignition of the joint. Someone in the gallery cried out. The master commanded, assist me. Pin the shoulder. The apprentice bent to obey. Hands moved to hold the body still. The crowd recoiled even as their eyes fixed on procedure. The ledger had suggested a sequence that required the noble to remain alive through certain cuts. The physician objected aloud and stepped toward the slab. The marshal's men reached to hold him back. For 3 lightning-fast moments the chamber resembled a scale with authority pulled between law and ritual. The physician called, you risk the artery. Stop. The master, no. The joint must be freed first. Trust the line. Trust the hands. Their voices collided in 3 short exchanges. Then the master declared that only a live completion would settle guilt and demand. He thrust the blade with a practiced swing and completed the harsh sequence. The sound the blade made against bone and the thin, wet sound of flesh yielding rose together. The noble's breath spat out. Spectators either averted eyes or stood frozen. The master followed through with a methodical rhythm that had been honed in private. As the master worked, the court physician leaned over the ledger and pointed to a notation about unapproved dissection. He shouted, this is not teaching. This is experimentation. Arrest him! The marshal hesitated. The crowd's mood buckled between revulsion and awe. The apprentice's hands trembled on the table as the master shifted tools and kept counting under his breath. When the final separation came, The gallery released a sound that was not applause. It was a collective intake and a scattering of curses. The master stepped back and wiped his gauntleted hand on the leather apron. The noble's body heaved once and then stilled. The master did not look triumphant. He looked exhausted and measured. The ledger lay open with inked lines that matched the master's cuts. The immediate aftermath was a fracture of authority. The marshal signaled guards and instructed that the ledger and the master be taken under custody for further inquiry. The physician demanded that the apprentice be detained for questioning and that the noble's family be notified. Will hold a tribunal at dawn. The marshal will assemble witnesses and read these pages in full. His voice turned the spectacle into a legal proceeding. In the dim cell off the dungeons, the apprentice sat on a narrow bench and turned the master's tools in his hands. He spread the ledger across his knees and read the neat script. The entries described precise cuts and the dates of various tests. The apprentice felt two currents inside him, the pull to learn the craft that had just been demonstrated and the recoil from what he had helped perform. That conflict shaped the choice he would make. The master was led away under guard. His signature items, the broad axe, the serrated pendant, were catalogued and taken. The marshal's men recorded the sequence of events in a ledger of their own. The court physician wrote notes on loose sheets and left them with his clerk. The gallery emptied in low, shocked clusters, carrying gossip and outrage back into the corridors of power. The court's inquiries began immediately. Witnesses were summoned. The marshal ordered testimony from the apprentice, the master, and the physician. The condemned noble's surviving attendants were questioned about consent and prior threats. The ledger's ink had set a new frame. This was no longer a private claim of mastery. It was evidence that might remove a sanctioned instrument of the crown. The apprentice answered questions in short, clipped sentence. CC placed the blade where he marked. He said he did what I was told. The marshal, did you see the noble give consent? The apprentice shook his head no. The court's mood hardened. The physician demanded that the crown consider punishment for unauthorized experiments. The master refused to deny his method, but objected to the framing of experimentation as crime when the crown had ordered efficiency. Outside the tribunal, the apprentice's choice gathered companions and enemies. Some courtiers whispered that the master had preserved order through skill. Others whispered that the master had turned the crown's tools into instruments of curiosity. The court physician read aloud sections of the ledger in the presence of the marshal and two clerks. He underlined passages that implied a sequence of live tests performed across several months. A deputy of the marshal found a notation in a margin that recorded a name. The name tied an earlier private execution to a missing servant in a neighboring manor. That discovery bent the investigation into a new shape. The marshal's deputy looked up and said, "This links the master's practices to a disappearance." The gallery's rumor mill leapt forward. The ledger that had seemed only technical now suggested a pattern with victims beyond spectacle. The master objected. Those notes are shorthand from campaigns. Soldiers die in battle. There is no crime in learning how bodies break. His voice remained calm. The physician answered with quick, sharp sentences. There is a line between technique, taught in war, and experiments, performed in quiet rooms on living subjects. You crossed that line. The confrontation expanded, craftsmanship versus ethics, obedience versus law. The marshal called for a pause. He ordered the master kept under guard, but allowed the apprentice to remain near until the tribunal reconvened. He also requested that the noble's body be preserved and sent for a formal inspection by court surgeons. The marshal's decision split the court's appetite for immediate retribution and careful legal process. That night, the master sat in his cell and touched the long scar that ran from temple to cheek. He folded his hands over the leather of his apron, as if feeling for the tools that were no longer present. He paced twice, counting under his breath. He knew what lay at stake: reputation, livelihood, the delicate favor of the crown. He also knew he had perfected a technique that served a very practical demand: swift, public execution with minimized disruption, and now that practice was a crime by the ledger's light. The apprentice kept turning pages of the ledger. He read dates and locations and small annotations that made the experiments sound methodical rather than random. His fingers trembled when he reached the passage that described a test where the subject had been kept conscious during a partial separation to observe muscular contraction. He closed the book and pressed it to his chest. The book's weight and the smell of ink fixed the present decision in a tangible way. 2 shifts of feeling had driven him across the chapter. First, fear that obeying would mark him as complicit. Then a cold clarity when he understood what those inked notes implied. The choice crystallized not as an abstract moral leap, but as a decision about where he would place his hands next. He could learn exactly how the master worked and become the next instrument, or he could refuse and speak the ledger's truth to the tribunal. The next morning the tribunal began in earnest. Witnesses testified. The master answered calmly and repeatedly insisted his methods served order. The physician read from the ledger and called named experiments. The apprentice was asked to recount the demonstration step by step. Each recounting forced him to touch the same motions again in speech: the placement of the blade, the master's tilt of head, the file's rasp. That repetition hardened his memory into evidence. During cross-examination, the master a pointed question about the notation linking to the missing servant. The master paused, then spoke: "Campaign records and execution notebooks are not the same. We do not hide bodies. If names appear, they are soldiers who fell in battle." The physician then presented a witness. A clerk who had copied a private account naming the missing servant, and the date that matched an entry in the ledger. The clerk's testimony added a twist to the case. He recalled seeing the master escort a servant from a private chamber late one night. The clerk had been ordered to keep silent. He had not spoken until now. His account changed how the assembly saw the ledger entries. The marshal leaned forward. He, the master, who gave the order that night. The master looked across the room, then downward. He named no patron. His silence widened suspicion. After hours of testimony, the tribunal adjourned and set the matter for further inquiry. The master was led back to a holding cell. The apprentice was allowed to sit by the window of the antechamber and read the ledger again while clerks transcribed passages. The court physician collected samples from the noble's body and arranged a formal report for the tribunal. In the quiet between proceedings, the apprentice made a choice. He called for a clerk and said, "I will show where the line ran and what was done. I will not hide it." His voice did not tremble now with simple fear. It carried the steady cadence born from having just performed the act, and from the ledger's ink unspooling the truth. The clerk nodded and began to copy his statement. Outside, the court buzzed with new angles. Some courtiers argued the master had been indispensable. Others wanted immediate punishment for unauthorized experiments. The marshal watched both camps and knew the final judgment would rely on the ledger, the testimonies, and the crown's will. The chapter closed on a concrete beat. The marshal ordered the ledger sealed and brought to the crown's chancellery, and he instructed the guards to place the master in irons and escort him to the central lockroom for the night. The apprentice handed his written account to the clerk and watched the clerk lock it in a chest. The chest's iron strap closed with a hard, bright click. The chamber's immediate danger had receded, but institutional consequences now stood in place. The ledger traveled with men who carried torches down a corridor. The apprentice sat on the cold bench and counted his breaths in measures learned under the master's tutelage. His hands were steady enough to fold the folded petitions he had written, but his palms remembered the rasp of metal. The decision he had made to speak would bind him to a course whose consequences had barely begun. Outside the antechamber, a single courier mounted a horse and rode toward the chancellery with the sealed ledger. The marshal watched the courier go and returned to his desk with the list of witnesses. The court physician collected his notes and placed them into a satchel. The master in irons listened to the measured footsteps and counted his own scars as if they were pages in a ledger. The apprentice closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and read one more line in the copied statement before handing it to the clerk. The clerk nodded and moved toward the chest. The royal marshal's boot hit the flagstone loud enough that the master executioner looked up and answered before the command finished. "Master, you will make it clean." Now fear tightened the master executioner's fingers on the haft. He did not flinch because his hands had learned to hold certainty against a crowd. The summons had arrived at dusk, a curt seal, an order to perform a public dismemberment at once, and the clear threat that failure meant loss of station and reputation. The problem was concrete and immediate: produce the spectacle the crown demanded, or be stripped of tools, wages, and standing, and everyone in the antechamber already judged him by the sag of his shoulders. He moved through the antechamber with methodical steps, cataloguing damage along the way a mason notes cracks. The marshal, red-faced and short-breathed now that the court had gathered, watched the master lay his boots on the oak floor, and did not Smilu need precision. The marshal, the assembled nobles, and the master precision or disgrace, the master answered with a single nod. He believed in precision more than he believed in speech. His life had been practice, repetition, the mechanical acceptance of weight and angle. Pride, quietly held, twined with fear in those first minutes, fear of losing the only work he had ever been permitted to own, and pride in a craft hung past mercy. They moved to the preparation alcove. The apprentice carried trays and set them down with nails of anxiety catching his palms. The master and apprentice unwrapped axes, whetstones, bone hooks, and files. The master wiped a haft with a strip of cloth and counted his strikes under his breath. The court physician arrived with a lamp and thin, precise gloves. He had the air of someone who catalogued bodies for a living. His hands smelled of vinegar and old linen. Lay him out, the physician. The condemned lord was brought in, pale under torchlight, his wrists bound. The master watched the man's features without curiosity and found a problem in the bones as the physician peeled back cloth and examined tendon and joint. The discovery came like a small, hard report. The physician tapped a bone line and frowned. There is an ossification near the ulna. He said a collis that will catch the haft. The physician's voice was factual, but the words cut the room. The master adjusted his grip and made the measurements he always made: angle, distance, arc. The calculation changed on the spot. The ritual that had always been a practiced, almost mechanical sequence suddenly contained a variable that could split flesh wrong. That shift from confidence to cold calculation was the first emotion change of the night, suspicion settling into a tight, worked focus. The apprentice, pale and young, tried a practice alignment on the spare stump and misjudged by a finger's breadth. Wood splintered where tendon would have been. The master snapped his gaze to the boy again. He ordered again. "And keep your fingers from the edge." The marshal's mouth thinned. "If you fail, master," the marshal, letting the final words hang, "we will need someone else," the court murmured. The master's jaw set. The second emotion shift moved across his face, from contained dread to sharp anger, not at the accused but at the idea of his workmanship being relitigated in whispers. They arranged a quick rehearsal. The master placed the axe on the block and felt the haft's balance. He felt the old pride, a memory of past work, of a swing that had split bone cleanly under the eyes of a packed yard. He remembered a past execution where the axe had met bone with a sound he still replayed when sharpening, a dry, final note that told him everything had gone according to plan. He did not name the memory. He measured it in hand positions and breath. The marshal watched his hands and tapped the rod once on the floor. "When you mount that platform, master, make the crowd look away in a single instant with one swing." His voice was not loud, but people in the antechamber repeated the phrase like a caution. At that moment, the condemned lord lifted his head and fixed the master with a look that emptied the room. Gaston. The condemned said an old name, rough and small. The master stopped. The name landed like a worm inside his stoic chest. He had not been called by any private name in public for 20 years. The apprentice glanced between them. The marshal's eyes narrowed. Recognition crackled into the air. Private history had found the platform. The master kept his hands working. The name had introduced a complication that pitted memory against duty. This was the second turn of emotion, suspicion curdling into something more volatile, stinging shame, and a tremor of loss that made his breath shorter. Master, your hands. The marshal, too louder, you require more time. The master did not answer at once. He closed his eyes for a fraction and felt the scar along his temple. He thought of the single line of work that had kept him fed, method, not mercy. The condemned's name forced a new calculation. If the condemned was someone he once knew, the master faced a choice he had never allowed himself before: act with personal feeling or act as the crown demanded. He chose the crown. O time, the master, voice low and measured, will precede his voice, tried to be a blade of clarity. The line wavered. They formed the procession to the scaffold. Torch bearers fell into line. The courtiers took their prescribed seats. The court physician padded behind the condemned with his lamp, repeating his inspection under the torch's thin glow. The apprentice's hands shook when he adjusted the ropey prentice. The master, steady the shoulders. The boy's reply came in a whisper. Yes. Master, the stage set itself like a machine returning to form. But the knot of private recognition tightened in the master's chest every time the condemned met his eyes. He counted the swing points once, twice, thrice in a small, controlled breath. The third emotion shift began, controlled resolve giving way to a precise, brittle determination. On the platform, the crowd's faces blurred into distance as the master took his place. The marshal stepped forward and announced the crime. His words were performance as law. The master felt his shoulders lock and took the first practiced swing to clear a ceremonial bark of cloth and give the crowd the expected cadence. The axe sang through air. The first strike landed as it had in the past, clean. Ritualized, but as the master raised the axe for the decisive blow over the condemned's limb, something in the bone structure snagged the haft differently than the rehearsal. The haft did not glide, it gripped. The master felt the vibration against his palms and a sound that was not the right note, something like wood hitting iron unevenly hold. The marshal barked. Soldiers moved in reflex. The court leaned forward. The master's hand tightened on the haft and he bent, judging angle and force. The physician shouted, "Do not pull. The callus will bind the edge." The apprentice moved as if to push the condemned aside to free the swing, and the marshal slapped his wrist back. "Stay clear," soldiers warned. The crowd's murmur rose like pressure. The ritual that depended on one exact movement had become a slow, public mechanical failure. The master felt his face go hot. His training demanded an immediate, sure correction. He tried to adapt: small wrist tilt, a fraction more weight, but the haft bound, and then shuddered as the blade clove against an unexpected ridge in the bone. Flesh resisted in a manner had not encountered that night. The moment spread out, precise and rotten. A noise broke from the stands. A woman gasped. The marshal leaned forward and barked at the master. "Finish it!" The master moved as if to obey, and the haft caught in the bone again. He had only two choices in the next beat: force the swing and risk an obscene tear, or step back and permit the marshal to seize control for the spectacle. He hesitated for the slightest measure. That hesitation, like a hairline fracture, widened into violence. The marshal surged forward to take the haft. The master flinched and grabbed the haft to stop the marshal's hand. "Marshal, the master, low and measure radio will ruin the work." The marshal shoved him off. Hands collided. A soldier grabbed the master by the elbow. The master's reaction was sudden and physical. He shoved the soldier away, more force than the situation required. The marshal's face flushed. The court perceived a challenge. The apprentice shouted the master's name and tried to step between men, but a noble elbowed him aside. The maid in the crowd screamed. The ritual dissolved into a scuffle. The condemned's body slipped. The axe came down at a wrong angle and met bone with a ragged sound. The master, seeing the trajectory, lunged in a final attempt to correct the cut. His axe glanced and the haft cracked with a single, clean, sickening snap. The broken haft tipped the blade sideways. Blood spattered the stone. The crowd's roar collapsed into a sudden, horrified silence. Soldiers surged. The marshal shouted, "Seize him!" A captain grabbed the master's arm. The master did not resist beyond a cramped attempt to free his hand, so he could pick up a small file he wore on his belt. His fingers closed only on air as men forced him down. The apprentice ducked under a soldier's grasp and tried to reach the master with a small leather tool, one file the master had used for decades. The soldier struck the apprentice backhandedly. The master saw the apprentice's face go white and then set in the jaw as he hid the file in his sleeve and vanished into the press, stealing away like a shadow with a single instrument. The marshal's voice rang above the pushing bodies. He failed the ritual. He is treasonous. He would have marred the crown's justice. The court physician stepped between, adjusting his lamp and shouting, "Stop! Do not." But the soldiers had a mandate and the master's wrists were bound. They dragged the master from the platform into the courtyard. The condemned's body was torn away to be tended by physicians and taken from the yard, a private thing now outside the court's spectacle. The marshal turned the press toward narrative. He called a scribe and dictated terms. The execution method had failed due to the master's negligence. The master was to be stripped. The marshal's voice was not sudden. It was the steady imposition of a verdict. The master could hear the sound of the scribe's scratching and the marshal's cadence in the accusation, as if it were another instrument cutting his name. In the courtyard beyond the scaffold, the master found himself alone for a moment with the broken haft at his feet and the tarnished crown in the marshal's hands. Men moved around them like sheaves. The apprentice crept near and dropped a small, blood-darkened file near the master's boot. The master crouched and slid the file into his palm with a single finger. He did not meet the apprentice's eyes. The apprentice whispered, "Master." The master nodded once. That small exchange contained a universe of meaning and a private choice. The boy had stolen a tool and given it to him. The master felt the cramped relief of one narrow thing preserved. The final twist had already begun to crystallize. Skill could be taken, but a single instrument, hidden, could preserve the technique in a sliver of secrecy. The marshal stared at the master and announced the charges. He spoke with legal certainty, listing the crown's expectations and the master's failures. The master listened and felt the slow unwinding of his life. Tools surrendered, wages stopped, a name raised from court rolls. Soldiers led him away to the marshal's appointed cell, where the floor smelled of old urine and the torchlight made the stones look like a ledger of worn lines. The master did not argue. He counted the steps and the weight of the file in his palm like a memory of work. His hands shook once, then steadied. He thought in measures of angles and iron, not in pleas. At dawn, the marshal arranged for the court to issue a revised account. A scribe read a formal statement. The procedure had been compromised through negligence. The master had endangered the crown's justice. The wording rewrote the event into a tidy story of failure. The master stood in a narrow cell and listened to the echo of the scribe's voice outside the barred window. Soldiers came and went. The apprentice did not speak openly in court, but he had already left with a single tool hidden beneath his cloak, and something like a promise in his posture. The master kept one small object, the file, its edge nicked from decades of sharpening. He pressed it into his palm and felt its balance-length weight, the sound it made when tapped on a block. He used it in the quiet hours, scraping a small, private edge into a splinter of wood until the haft lay smooth and new beneath his fingers. He began in secret to fashion another haft from a scrap he found behind the stable. The work kept him from panic and also from collapse. It was not escape. It was a way to preserve craft beyond the court's reach. Weeks later, as dawn slit through the cell bars, the apprentice came at unannounced. He left a folded scrap of parchment pushed under the door, and then retreated into the dawn. The parchment held a single sentence in the apprentice's cramped hand. "I kept the file like you taught me the master read it twice," and felt a cold, steady clarity. The crown could erase a man's office, but could not undo what had been taught by calloused hands. He stared at the parchment and then at the file. The two objects, paper and metal, became a ledger of private continuity. In the public record, the marshal's version held sway. He wrote about a ritual botched through incompetence, about a master who had failed to account for bodily variation. The court accepted the writing because the marshal supplied witnesses, and because a broken haft was visible evidence the master had no way to negate. They paraded the broken haft before those who would listen and called it the instrument of failure. The master watched this rewriting with a quiet face. He did not yell. He had seen his reputation erode in the clatter of shoes and the scratch of quills. He preserved instead the precise measures in his head and the small file inching a new haft toward usable balance. People left the yard with their narratives set. The marshal claimed the victory of order. The court physician rewrote his notes to show the bone deformity that had not been noticed in earlier accounts. The apprentice vanished into the guild streets and took work at a wheelwright's, carrying within his sleeve a tool that would teach a new hand. The master remained known to some as a man who had failed the crown. To others who had watched him for years, he remained the only man who ever cut with a particular economy of arc and patience. In taverns where workmen gathered, older men would still hiss his techniques to one another when they thought the marshal's push could not hear them. The master, stripped of title and place, kept his hands moving. He shaped the haft and hammered mortise and tenon into a new balance on a scrap of oak. He taught the apprentice in secret once a week beneath loose boards in a stable, where their voices would not carry hold closer. He told the boy, "Watch the bone line." Not the scream, the apprentice repeated. "Watch the bone line, not the scream, and learn to breathe through the sound." These were lessons of craft and also of survival. They carried a moral weight the master offered without speech. Months later, a rumor began at market. The marshal had arranged a new spectacle and had borrowed the best of other executioners' tools to shore up the court's story. A nobleman who had been at the broken ritual spoke in private to a blacksmith and described the moment the haft split. He mentioned, orphaned, a name the marshal had used when he accused the master of treason. The rumor spread and complicated the tidy narrative the marshal wanted. In private rooms, some nobles questioned whether the marshal had used the event to remove an inconvenient man under the pretense of failure. That questioning was small and slow, but it moved like a hairline crack along the stones of power. One night, the marshal came upon the master in the stable where the master taught the apprentice. He recognized the master by the compact way he held a small tool. The marshal's entourage blocked the doorway. He nothing at first, then, in a measured voice, "You teach without sanction," the master did not stand. He kept scraping the haft. "They will say you conspire." The marshal continued, "They will say you plot revenge." The master looked up once, and his voice, when he used it, was small and dry. "Teach a boy to do honest work," he said. "He teach him balance." The marshal's jaw tightened. Soldiers moved to seize the master, but a small noble, a man who had watched the broken haft and had an old grudge against the marshal, stepped forward and said, "Let him be." The marshal hesitated. The old grudge nudged a seed of doubt into public record. The story settled into an uneven compromise. The marshal kept his seat, and his scribe kept the original line. The master kept his small file and a handful of pupils who learned in places where no herald dared to repeat words. The apprentice eventually left the city with a horse and a sack of hidden tools. The master continued to work, his hands teaching a new handful of those who wanted the craft at its best rather than the crown's spectacle. The court rearranged its tales. The community adjusted around the absence of a single official. In the final scene behind closed doors, the master buried the broken haft under a flagstone outside the antechamber, where no one would walk the exact spot twice. He placed the file above it and covered both with mortar. The action was not spectacle. It was a small, private burial. He stood and walked away with the apprentice at his side, the apprentice carrying a simple leather roll of tools. The marshal decreed that a new executioner be appointed under his choice. The scribe amended phrases to show caution. The master left with less than before, but with a private continuity intact, tools hidden, lessons imparted, a technique living in hands not registered by the crown. The chapter closes with a concrete beat. The marshal signed a new warrant at dusk. A courier carried it into the city. The apprentice rode east with a bag of tools. And the master at dawn set the new haft into the rough axe and swung it once into a pile of trimmed timber to test balance. The swing met wood with familiar sound, then a measured series of taps. He nodded once to the wood, to the lesson, to the apprentice who had learned to keep a file safe. The ritual that had defined him in public was ended, but the craft he had honed survived in hidden, steady strokes.